Russia's not taking the United States seriously. And to be fair, why would they? I mean, we're not following through on the threats that we do make, and we're in the process of dialing back Ukrainian military aid, not just in the future, but today. So from Russia's perspective, Putin's perspective, why do anything different? And what they're doing right now is an ever-increasing volume and intensity of drone and missile strikes on Ukrainian cities. I mean, just the last 2 nights saw 821 munitions fired into Ukraine. I would argue that those have actually picked up in recent days, which is notable because we just passed President Trump's most recent 2-week notice to Vladimir Putin. Now, going back to April 27th, we had President Trump on camera 3 different times give Russia 2 weeks. Say you have 2 weeks to show us that you're actually serious about peace with kind of this veiled threat that, or else something might happen, like sanctions or anything at all. President Trump gave the 2 weeks notice on April 27th. That, of course, is expired. He gave another 2 weeks notice on May 19th. That has expired. And May 28th was his most recent 2 weeks notice. That also just expired. I think it's safe to say that in the course of these threats, we've actually seen an increase in Russian drone and missile strikes against Ukrainian cities. Again, there's no incentive for Putin to change the way that he is operating today. In fact, President Zelensky appears to be getting more and more frustrated, and he's starting to direct those frustrations back at the countries like the United States that are saying, hey, we just want peace. We want this to end. He's saying, cool, do something about it. Earlier today, Zelensky put out a statement saying, quote, Russian strikes with missiles and Shaheeds, the long-range drones, are louder than the efforts of the United States and others in the world to force Russia to peace. Every night, instead of a ceasefire, there have been massive strikes with Shaheeds, cruise missiles, and ballistics. It is important that the response to this and other similar Russian strikes is not the silence of the world, but concrete actions. Actions by America, which has the power to force Russia to peace. The actions of Europe, which has no alternative but to be strong. The actions of others in the world who have called for diplomacy and an end to the war and who have been ignored by Russia. Hard pressure is needed for peace. And he closed by saying everyone who called for an end to the killings and for diplomacy must act. And to that end, we've got a couple statements here from senior U.S. officials that I want to run through, kind of highlighting that we are more and more just kind of backing away from this, saying, I don't know, I think maybe we'll just sit this one out. The first one I want to play is from a Representative Kaptur, probably mispronouncing that, a Democrat from Ohio, questioning Secretary Hegseth in a hearing yesterday. And I want to start with hers because it does show that there are still people in the U.S. government that support Ukraine and want to see this war brought to a just end. But let's go ahead and start with the representative's question here.
One of my questions is, what are you doing to establish relations with Ukraine and not turn your back on them as an administration and help them win, help liberty win? This has implications way beyond the boundaries of Ukraine. Russia's got 11 time zones. I mean, this is the most important test of liberty for our NATO alliance in my lifetime, and we better help win. And that involves moving forward faster on drone technology. I'm very worried about our air bases where we have secure assets. Mr. Secretary, can we defend them today if they were to have a similar attack?
We're certainly very focused on that, ma'am. And we're learning every day from Ukraine. I think we would need to clarify what win means. This president is committed to peace. He's committed to stopping the killing. And he was not in office when it started in 2014. There were no additional incursions in his first term. And then under the previous administration, Vladimir Putin sought to take Ukraine. We're committed. This administration's committed to peace, to stopping the killing, and we think that serves.
Another reason I wanted to start with that clip is just Secretary Hegseth highlighting that the focus here is stopping the killing, bringing the war to an end, but the U.S. actions don't necessarily back that up. Now, I get the argument that our increasing military aid is not necessarily a guaranteed way to stop the killing or bring about a faster close to the war. I think there is a strategy where that could play out, but we seem to be doing the opposite, taking away the ability of Ukraine to defend themselves, and you'll see more of that here in a minute from the spokesperson Tammy Bruce of the State Department. But a couple key aspects there with Secretary Hegseth's response. He skipped out of the most recent Ukraine aid working group, which is where leaders from all across NATO get together with leaders from Ukraine to discuss what military needs Ukraine needs to fight, survive, and win on today's battlefield. That is so incredibly important to participate in, to understand the complexities of how this war is playing out. Even if we attend and say we're not going to contribute anything or we don't agree with anything being sent over, missing out on that is a loss for the United States. We need to be absorbing as many of these TTPs, as many of these tactics as possible. And the same goes with the representative went on to question Secretary Hegseth about why he hadn't made a trip to Ukraine yet. And I would say the same thing. Regardless of how you feel about supporting or not supporting Ukraine or our involvement, lack of involvement, over-involvement or anything, from a U.S. national security perspective, it is imperative that we take all of the possible lessons learned from this conflict in every direction. I wish that we had a better relationship right now than what we see on the surface, at least, between Secretary Hegseth, the seniors in the Pentagon, senior leaders in the Pentagon, and some of the Ukrainian leadership. They're not doing very much publicly, hardly at all, not making trips over there. It's right there. There's so much that we can learn for the future of warfare, and I'm a little bit nervous that we're missing out on it due to domestic partisan politics, and I hope that's not the case. Now, continuing on with Secretary Hegseth, he was asked about the continuation of military aid to Ukraine, and he made it pretty clear that aid going forward is going to be set to reduce. Here we go.
It is a reduction in this budget. As you know, this administration takes a very different view of that conflict. We believe a negotiated peaceful settlement is in the best interest of both parties and our nation's interests, especially with all the competing interests around the globe. I don't think the word victory has been well defined or the path to it. And as a result, a path to peace that stops the killing and the carnage is something that President Trump is very invested in.
So we're going to shift over then to a press briefing from Tammy Bruce, the spokesperson for the State Department, where she was pressed on some of these similar issues, I'll say. Notably that, hey, Ukraine is coming under increased drone and missile attack. What are we doing? Are we doing anything to try to bring this to a close? Because on the one hand, we're talking about that. But are we taking any serious actions, any concrete steps? Like the Russian concrete steps have been to increase attacks in recent days and weeks. What concrete steps are we taking? Because from the perspective, there's a couple of reporters that call this out. Of course, we have in this this House hearing, subcommittee hearing, they're calling out the secretary saying, hey, we need to be doing more to provide more. When we get over to the State Department, they're saying, why are we taking things away? And the spokesperson's response here, I think, is indicative. It's going to be frustrating to listen to, no matter how you feel about this subject, because she just waffles left and right. But I think it's indicative of some bigger issues here around the U.S. response to this conflict. So let's go ahead and start with Tammy Bruce here, State Department spokesperson.
Yes.
Ukraine has been under massive drone attacks, particularly Kyiv last night. Given that Ukrainian president said publicly that they have been asking for permission from the U.S. To purchase air defense systems that they can mitigate Russian attacks. Why wouldn't the U.S. let them purchase air defenses, much needed air defense systems?
Well, I can't speak to the details of purchase decisions or negotiations about what we're going to allow to be purchased by an ally. That is the Department of Defense, effectively. What I do know is what the President has said and what the Secretary of State has said in a number of venues is that we certainly, and we've been Ukraine's biggest supporter and defender, literally, is that we want them to have surface-to-air missile protections, right? We want them to be able to deal with incoming missiles. We know that it's been discussed about our European partners who have those systems from us to get them to Ukraine. There's a number of different negotiations and aspects involved in this kind of dynamic that does not involve the State Department. It's about munitions and purchasing and all of that. What I do know is that we are doing and continue to wish to do as much as we can. That is not disputed. And I understand the Ukrainians, who are great friends of this country and have done, there's no disputing the bravery and the commitment of the Ukrainian people.
All right, so that was a lot of nothing, right? Like, I don't even know how we ended up with the bravery of the Ukrainian people, cannot be questioned. He's asking about the air defense systems that, why can we not sell more of those to Ukraine? And one of the challenges that, from my perspective, we're seeing here is the State Department defers things to the Defense Department. The Defense Department defers things to the State Department or the President. And across the board, they all say, well, the President has the ultimate authority here, or it's Witkoff. This is a diplomatic process here, bringing about the end of the war. It is state and defense hand in hand. right? CIA involved as well, and other organizations. I understand that they all don't want to answer for one another, but it doesn't seem like we're able to get those clear answers from anyone. For an example, the reallocation of weapons from Ukraine to the Middle East, you'll see here in a second, the State Department does not have that answer. We've not seen much from the DOD on that. The White House has not responded. Then you have the Russian sanctions or adding additional pressure on Russia from the United States. Why have they evaded the most recent round of tariffs in the United States, right? These questions that seem like they should be pretty key and pretty simple to answer, we're getting pointed in every different direction, and it's very hard to understand what the U.S. strategy is as it relates to this conflict right now. But again, to the reporter's credit here at the State Department briefing, he pushed Ms. Bruce here saying, no, I'm talking about like, why are weapons that were set aside for Ukraine to defend their skies today being reallocated to the United States? Do you have any, like, just information on that? Not even saying it was wrong, just like, can you provide more context on that exact issue? Here's our answer.
Can you help us clarify, reports that the United States has redirected some of the promised defensive weapons from Ukraine? Well, it's supposed to go to Ukraine, but they redirected to the Middle East. Is that accurate?
I can't speak to that. That is not something that, whether it is or is not happening, it's a decision that is clearly one based in national security if it's happening, and certainly a diplomatic framework that, if a decision has been made, is not something I'm going to remark on here at the podium.
Look, I know spokespeople, like, most of their job is just kind of twisting and not answering questions, but my God, I feel like that was a masterclass in just... like, there's nothing we gained from any of that, which is so frustrating because, again, I feel like so much of this is just unclear with how we're progressing. Now, on the other side of the aisle here, if you will, from the Russian perspective, they seem to be relatively optimistic with the direction things are going. Their ambassador to the United States just earlier today, in an interview with Russian media TASS, talked about some of the things that he's working on negotiating with the United States, especially around an ongoing possible peace talk that the United States may broker between Russia and Ukraine. He said some of the key aspects here. Again, the Russian ambassador to the United States, it's expected that negotiations with the United States will soon begin on the restoration of direct air traffic, so flying back and forth, the United States to Russia. Russia has handed over to the U.S. a roadmap for the return of confiscated diplomatic facilities, and Russia is conducting substantive discussion with the United States about simplifying the issuance of visas. Like, everything you brought up was like a positive for Russia. Again, this is why, from Russia's perspective, why change anything? What they're doing right now is working to a degree, right? At the very least, they're really not getting any sort of external pressure to change what they're doing day in and day out. All right, so moving over to our favorite Russian doom poster, Igor Girkin, penned a long letter. Again, he's writing more and more of these from like house arrest, where he said that, for Russia, the recent days here have been a significant change for the worse. And there's a couple key things he highlights here that I wanted to call out. First, he says the intervention of the armed forces of the Coalition of the Willing is close to inevitable. In fact, it is in the stage of feverish preparation. The Coalition of the Willing is a handful of European countries, most likely, that are going to contribute troops, military personnel, and equipment to Ukraine. It's been a little vague as to what that would entail. We've had a lot of countries say they're interested or they will probably participate. When it's the Coalition of the Willing, everybody gets to determine what they send, right? So a country could potentially participate in that by sending a vehicle for another country to man, right? So let's be very careful with assuming this is going to be like multiple brigades from multiple different countries. But nonetheless, at least one Russian's perspective there is that this is really coming together and it's going to happen soon. I have not seen the evidence for that. From my perspective, it looks like that's really being drug out and that people are kind of, it's all in the talk phase right now. There's no concrete plans, but nonetheless, I do think it is interesting that has at least got the attention of some in Russia saying, hey, this thing is going to happen before too long. Whether they're actively fighting on the front lines, which is very unlikely, I would say at this point, or providing more logistical support in the rear, maybe even air defense support, probably more likely. But either way, some in Russia see that as happening here pretty soon. The second one has to do with Ukraine's ability to continually hit Russian targets deep inside of Russia with drones. He says the enemy has acquired the ability to deliver targeted and precise strikes on Russian defense and strategically important industrial facilities deep in Russian territory. And what is even more important, the enemy has proven in practice its ability to hit these targets massively and regularly. And then he goes on to vent that they can't do the same because all of the important Ukrainian locations are inside of NATO countries, which is a bit of a stretch. I mean, in the one sense, like when you're talking about the manufacture of Bradley fighting vehicles, yeah, Russia can't hit those because they're not in Ukraine at all. But there are still a lot of places in Ukraine instrumental to the Ukrainian war effort. They don't have to start hitting Bradley production facilities or HIMARS production facilities in the United States to have some sort of impact on the war. Another interesting topic here is that apparently the United States is getting more and more concerned that China is going to be getting closer to Ukraine, especially around the reconstruction process here, and that may open up access for some of these Ukrainian rare earths to China rather than the United States. Now, we do have one of those agreements, rare earth mineral agreements with Ukraine. I'm not entirely sure the details of that. It might still just be a framework, but nonetheless, this points to kind of a bigger issue here, I think. They say U.S. President Donald Trump's administration has asked Ukraine for assurance that it will not allow China under any circumstances to enter its rare earth market, in particular under the name of reconstruction after Russia's war ends. White House officials suspect that China has been quietly laying the groundwork for its potential involvement in Ukraine after a possible ceasefire or a deal between the war-torn country and Beijing's regional partner, Russia. In March, China formally announced its intention to seek a role in Ukraine's post-war reconstruction. The move came just weeks after Chinese foreign minister met with his Ukrainian counterpart on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference. The two countries signed a few agreements this spring, further expanding farm product trade and cooperation. So that relationship already exists there. And this is where you get into this realm of, again, I think it's relevant to today's video because we're talking about how from the Defense Department to the State Department, we're starting to see a bit of a stepping back from Ukraine in a lot of ways. This is the after, right? These, to be blunt, like the spoils of war is not necessarily the physical things that come out of the ground in this sense, but the relationships and the influence around the world that you have when you are on the victorious side of a conflict. So as the United States steps back more and more from our relationship with Ukraine, we lose the ability to influence this type of thing. And from Ukraine's perspective, I mean, we're already seeing it in some degrees where when we aren't providing as much aid or intel or targeting data, whatever it might be, Ukraine has a little more free hand to kind of do what they want. And they're saying, why would we run these operations through the United States when you're not doing A, B, C, and D for us? This is that rolled out over the course of the next couple of months, probably years, where China just has to be there and offer a little bit better deal. And the United States may not, depending on the trajectory that this is headed, we may not have the influence to say, no, we're going to be a better partner for reconstruction than China. All right, so I'm going to wrap up here with the LA protests here in the United States. I have not made any content about this yet. Still trying to kind of understand exactly what's happening. Very strong partisan divide here in the U.S., but I thought it was interesting that Russia has started to comment. So we've seen a few statements so far, nothing official, right? These are all coming from their mill bloggers, so take that with a grain of salt. Two majors said we support all sides in this conflict. Of course, they want to see just any sort of destruction inside of the United States. They took a picture or a video of a guy wearing a Soviet flag and said, our people are everywhere. Older Than Edda had an interesting one here where he kind of mocked Trump and the U.S. maybe, but kind of relating it to the ongoing war in Ukraine, where he says, quote, Trump is crazy. This war with California has already taken 500,000 lives of American soldiers and 250,000 rebels. We need to stop the war and make a deal, a great big deal, a peace deal, a piss deal, a deal so that everyone trades and gets rich. Trump needs to meet with the main rebel and make a deal. Caracas, Venezuela, is a great place to negotiate. So just, again, mocking, I think is a good way to put it. And then two majors just earlier today said, on June 14th, the fighters against Trump regime are planning their Maidan all over the United States. Are these already gifts for Russia Day? So I'm not bringing this up to suggest that there's like massive Russian influence in these protests at all. It just, maybe there is, right? I've not seen that come out in one way or the other quite yet. But they are looking at this saying, good, any distraction, any damage inside of the United States, whenever Americans are turning on each other, it's good for Russia. So I felt like it was worth bringing up a little bit. That is something we'll try to keep an eye on as well. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.